Imagine you're the star of your own TV show. Every episode is about you, your feelings, your decisions, your opinions. You wake up in the morning, and the first thing you do is check your phone to see what people are saying about you. Are they praising you? Criticizing you? You spend the day carefully, crafting your responses, making sure everyone knows exactly what you think and feel. You're in control, and that feels good, but it's also exhausting. One day, you realize that everyone around you is doing the same thing. They're all starring in their own shows, and no one is really paying attention to anyone else. Your best friend is too busy worrying about their own drama to listen to yours. Your family is too preoccupied with their own problems to notice yours. You start to feel alone, even in a room full of people. You're all playing the same game, but no one is winning. This is the soap opera of the self. We're all so focused on our own emotions, opinions, and decisions that we forget about everyone else. We become narcissistic, fussy, and self-centered. It's not just a bit of self-indulgence. It's a deep, pervasive problem that affects how we live, love, and interact with the world. Think about it. How often do you spend time thinking about your own feelings? How often do you worry about what you think about things or how you should act? You might be indecisive because you enjoy the power of being in control. Or you might be a perfectionist because you're afraid of making a mistake. Either way, you're caught up in your own mental states, and it's hard to break free. But the real issue isn't just that we're self-centered. It's that this self-centeredness keeps us from seeing and helping others. When you're so focused on your own feelings, it's easy to ignore the needs of the people around you. You might not even notice when someone is hurting or in trouble. Instead of reaching out to help, you're too busy with your own drama. This self-obsession isn't just a personal problem, it's a spiritual one. When we're so caught up in our own feelings, it's hard to connect with God. Prayer becomes a time to focus on how you're feeling instead of connecting with the divine. You might ask, am I being reverent enough? Am I really feeling God's presence? But the more you focus on your own emotions, the less you can truly connect with God. Love isn't just a feeling, it's an action. When we're too busy with our own soap operas, we don't have the time or energy to love others. We might say we love someone, but if we're not doing anything to show it, what's the point? Real love means putting others first, even if it means sacrificing your own comfort or desires. So, how do you break free from the soap opera of the self? How do you start to see the world and the people in it through a different lens? The first step is to recognize the problem. Once you see how much time and energy you spend on yourself, you can start to make a change. It won't be easy, but it's worth it. Because when you break free from the soap opera, you might just find a new kind of joy, a joy that comes from knowing that you're not the center of the universe, but part of something much bigger and more meaningful. John Calvin's life was a series of unexpected turns, each leading him closer to his ultimate purpose. Born in 1509 in Noyon, France, Calvin was raised in the Roman Catholic Church, just like most people in France at the time. His father initially wanted him to become a priest, but later decided that Calvin should study law instead. This change of plans might seem strange, but it was during his legal studies that Calvin learned Greek, a skill that would prove invaluable in his future work with the Bible. After his father's death, Calvin broadened his studies. He was drawn to the new humanist movement, which focused on the study of ancient texts and ideas. This movement was crucial in producing the intellectual leaders of the Reformation. Calvin even wrote his first book, a scholarly work on the Roman philosopher Seneca. But his life took a dramatic turn when he experienced a powerful religious conversion. He described this moment as a sudden conversion that changed his heart and mind, leading him to a deeper understanding of God's grace. This experience shifted his focus from humanist scholarship to theology. In 1534, King Francis I of France began cracking down on the growing evangelical movement. Calvin, who had already been targeted for his evangelical views, decided to leave France and head for Germany, where the Reformation was more accepted. He spent time in Basel, a city near the French border, where he wrote the first edition of his masterpiece, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. This book was not a systematic theology but a guide for French evangelicals and a defense of their beliefs against accusations from the Roman Church. It was a revolutionary work that spread the gospel of grace and transformed the French-speaking world. Calvin's plan was to settle in Strasbourg, a city in Germany where evangelical scholars were welcome. However, war between France and Germany forced him to take a detour through Geneva, a city in western Switzerland. Geneva was a place of conflict with the common people, wanting a reformed church and the wealthy elites resisting church discipline. The city was divided, and the Reformation was constantly in danger. In Geneva, Calvin met Joachim Farel, a fiery reformer who saw Calvin's potential. Farel convinced Calvin to stay and help bring the city fully into the Reformation. Calvin, who was modest and did not see himself as a leader, initially refused, but after much prayer, he decided to stay. Calvin's leadership was crucial in Geneva, but it didn't come without challenges. He clashed with the city council over the issue of church discipline, insisting that the church, not the civil authorities, should have the power to discipline its members. This conflict led to his banishment in 1538. Calvin spent the next 3 years in Strasbourg, where he continued his work on the Institutes and translated the Psalms into French. He also married Idelette de Bure, a woman with 2 children, and they had a child of their own, Jacques, who tragically died shortly after birth. Calvin found comfort in God's control over all events, a theme that would shape his theology and writings. In 1541, the political situation in Geneva changed, and the city invited Calvin back. Despite initial reluctance, he returned and continued his preaching series exactly where he had left off 3 years earlier. Under his leadership, Geneva became a model of Reformed Christianity, where the gospel transformed daily life. Calvin taught people to see their homes and jobs as part of their spiritual journey, not just their church activities. This approach brought the elite in line with the needs of public morals and created a community that lived out the gospel in every aspect of life. Calvin's influence extended far beyond Geneva. His teachings and writings spread the Reformation around the world, shaping the beliefs and practices of many churches. His life, marked by unexpected turns and deep faith, continues to inspire and challenge people to this day. Calvin's legacy is a testament to the idea that God's plans often lead us in directions we never expected, but these paths can lead to great purpose and impact. Calvin, the influential figure of the Reformation, had a significant but complex impact on religious freedom. While he dedicated his life to challenging the majority views of his time, he also rejected the idea of religious freedom, which he saw as unbiblical. This stance was not unique to Calvin. It was shared by most people of his era. However, this doesn't fully excuse him, especially given his commitment to challenging the status quo from a biblical perspective. Despite this, it's important to note that there were very few actual cases of religious persecution in Geneva. The spiritual transformation of the city was mainly driven by excellent preaching and teaching, not by force. Geneva, being a small, theologically homogeneous community, didn't have many religious dissenters. The big debates over religious freedom were happening in larger, more diverse cities like London and Paris. In Geneva, the main conflicts were about who should control church discipline, civil authorities, or the church itself. Calvin advocated for the church's right to manage its own discipline, which was a significant departure from practices in other places like Zurich. He also promoted a relatively democratic church governance structure, which was different from what was happening in Germany. These contributions laid the groundwork for the later development of religious freedom. Calvin's work in Geneva had a profound impact on the spread of Protestantism. Geneva became a hub for evangelical scholars and leaders, and it played a crucial role in spreading the gospel to France, England, Scotland, the Netherlands, and eventually the New World. French-language books and treatises, including Calvin's Institutes, were widely distributed in France, much like how C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity influenced 20th-century England. During times of persecution in England and Scotland, many evangelical leaders sought refuge in Geneva, where they produced important works like the Geneva Bible, the first study Bible with notes explaining difficult passages. When conditions improved, these leaders returned to their home countries, equipped and encouraged to continue their ministry. This network of scholars and leaders, influenced by Calvin's teachings, was instrumental in spreading Protestantism globally during the first century of the Reformation. Lutheranism, in contrast, remained largely confined to Germanic and Scandinavian countries. Today, when people talk about Calvinism, they often refer to the 5 points of Calvinism, also known by the acronym TULIP. However, these 5 points are not a comprehensive or precise summary of Calvinistic doctrine. They are more of a mnemonic device designed to help people remember key aspects of Calvinism. Assuming they already understand the doctrine from other sources, TULIP stands for total depravity, the belief that humans are completely affected by sin; unconditional election, the belief that God chooses who will be saved regardless of their actions; limited atonement, the belief that Christ's death was specifically for the elect; irresistible grace, the belief that God's grace cannot be resisted by those chosen for salvation; perseverance of the saints, the belief that those chosen by God will remain faithful until the end. The myth that TULIP originated at the Synod of Dort in 1618 to 1619 is widespread but incorrect. The Synod did produce a set of 5 main points, but they are different from TULIP. ULIP actually emerged in the 20th century and wasn't widely used until the second half of that century. The earliest known mention of TULIP is from a 1913 magazine article, which traced it back to a 1905 lecture. Even then, the exact phrasing of TULIP varied over time. The historical TULIP acronym is not as important to Calvinism as many believe. It was not crafted by a large convention of theologians, but seems to have been created by one person and then popularized. This means that attributing TULIP to the Synod of Dort gives it more importance than it deserves. While TULIP does highlight the Trinitarian nature of Calvinistic doctrine, it also invites misunderstanding. For example, total depravity can be misinterpreted to mean that humans are as evil as they can possibly be, which is not what Calvinism teaches. Some people identify as 4-point Calvinists, agreeing with the T and U, total depravity and unconditional election, and the I and P, irresistible grace and perseverance of the saints, but rejecting the L, limited atonement. This view is often seen as an attempt to integrate a universalistic understanding of Christ's work with other Calvinistic doctrines. However, this position can be problematic. In traditional Calvinism, the Father, Son, and Spirit work together in a coherent system to bring about salvation. Four-point Calvinism, by rejecting limited atonement, disrupts this coherence. It suggests that Christ's work was universal, even though God has ordained that not all will be saved. This creates a logical inconsistency, as it implies that God acts as if he does not control all events, which contradicts the other points of Calvinism. Furthermore, if Christ's death did not actually save people but only made salvation possible, it raises the question of why Christ had to die at all. This is a challenging question for both four-point Calvinists and non-Calvinists, but the latter can at least provide a rationale based on the idea of free will. Four-point Calvinism, however, lacks this coherent explanation. There is some debate among scholars about whether Calvin himself ever endorsed four-point Calvinism. Some argue that certain remarks he made can be interpreted as supporting this view, while others disagree. Since Calvin did not systematically address this issue in his major works, it's difficult to determine his exact stance. For many people, including myself, the historical debate over Calvin's views on this specific issue is less important than the truth or falsehood of the doctrine itself. What matters most is whether four-point Calvinism is theologically sound. Once it's clear that this view is problematic, the historical question becomes less significant. In the end, the focus should be on understanding and evaluating the core teachings of Calvinism rather than getting caught up in historical debates. While Calvin's contributions to theology and the spread of Protestantism are undeniably significant, it's the truth of the doctrine that ultimately matters. The idea of free will and God's control is like trying to fit two puzzle pieces that don't seem to match. On one side, we believe that God is in charge of everything that happens. On the other side, we feel that we have the freedom to make our own choices. It's a bit like asking how a coin can be both heads and tails at the same time. It sounds impossible, but that's where faith and mystery come in. Calvinism, a branch of Christianity that traces its roots back to John Calvin, teaches that God is in complete control. This means that everything that happens, big or small, is part of God's plan. But at the same time, Calvinists also believe that people are responsible for their actions. This can seem confusing, even contradictory. If God controls everything, how can we be free to choose? The key is to understand that free will and God's control are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist even if we can't fully grasp how. Think of it like this. Imagine you're playing a game, and the game's creator is watching over you. The creator knows every move you'll make, but you still feel like you're making your own choices. That's a bit like how Calvinists see God's control and human free will. In the 16th century, when people like Erasmus, Luther, and Calvin were debating free will, they weren't talking about whether we can choose what to eat for breakfast or what to wear. They were discussing whether people are born naturally inclined to sin, or whether they can choose to avoid sin. They all agreed that people are responsible for their choices, but they had different ideas about the role of God in those choices. Calvinists believe that God's control doesn't mean He forces us to make decisions. Instead, God guides and directs our choices in a way that doesn't take away our freedom. It's like a parent teaching a child to ride a bike. The parent might hold the bike to keep it steady, but the child still feels like they're pedaling and steering. God's guidance is similar. He works behind the scenes to ensure that His plan is fulfilled, but He doesn't override our ability to make choices. One example of this is in the Bible, where God hardened Pharaoh's heart. This doesn't mean God forced Pharaoh to be stubborn. Instead, God allowed Pharaoh's natural stubbornness to continue, and Pharaoh was still responsible for his actions. God's control didn't take away Pharaoh's free will. It just directed it in a way that fit God's plan. The Westminster Confession of Faith, a key document in Calvinist teaching, explains this idea. It says that God guides all human actions without doing violence to human free will. This means that God works within our choices, not against them. When the Holy Spirit transforms a person's heart, that person is still free to choose to follow Christ. The transformation doesn't force them. It changes their desire, making them want to follow God. This idea is also reflected in the story of the prodigal son in the Bible. The son chooses to leave his father's house and live a wild life. Later, he chooses to return home. God's love and guidance are always present, but the son's choices are his own. God doesn't force him to come back. He changes the son's heart, making it possible for him to choose to return. The concept of moral inability is another important part of Calvinist teaching. This means that, without God's help, people are naturally unable to turn away from sin and toward God. It's not that they physically can't do it, it's that their nature is inclined toward sin. This doesn't mean they are robots or puppets. It means that without God's intervention, they won't choose to follow Him. But when God changes their hearts, they can and do choose to follow Him. Imagine a person who is addicted to a harmful habit. Without help, they might feel like they can't break free from it. But with the right support, they can overcome the addiction and make a new choice. In the same way, without God's help, people are trapped in sin. But with God's grace, they can break free and choose a new life. So, while it might seem mysterious or even impossible, Calvinism teaches that God's control and human free will can coexist. God is in charge, but we are still responsible for our choices. This might be a mystery, but it's a mystery we can live with, trusting that God's ways are higher than our ways. Isabella and Lord Angelo's conversation in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure shines a light on a deep truth about human nature. Isabella pleads for her brother's life, but Lord Angelo, a man who sees himself as morally superior, coldly refuses. When Isabella asks if he could pardon her brother if he wanted to, Angelo replies, "Look, what I will not, that I cannot do." This exchange captures the essence of what is called moral inability. It's not that Lord Angelo is physically unable to pardon her brother. He simply chooses not to, and his character prevents him from doing otherwise. This idea of moral inability is central to understanding how we think about sin and responsibility. Some people, like Lord Angelo, have a character that makes it very difficult for them to do certain good things. They might be able to do them, but their moral character prevents them from making that choice. On the other hand, there are people who, because of their character, are capable of doing things that others find morally repugnant. For example, there are people who are capable of committing violent acts, like killing their spouse, while others like you would find such an act morally impossible. This doesn't mean you are better or worse. It just means that your character is different. This concept of moral inability is also important in how we understand God. In the Bible, there are passages that say God can do certain things but chooses not to, like breaking His promises. Matthew chapter 26, verse 53-54. There are also passages that say God cannot do certain things, like lie. 2 Timothy 2:13. This isn't a contradiction. It's a way of saying that God's character is so good and holy that He will never choose to do anything that goes against His nature. Now, this leads to a bigger question. If we are born with a flawed character, how can we be responsible for our actions? This is a tricky question that has puzzled many people. Some say that if we are born with a sinful nature, then we can't be held responsible for our sins. But this is a misunderstanding. The Bible teaches that we are born with a nature that makes us prone to sin. But we are still responsible for the choices we make. This is because our character, even if flawed, is still a part of who we are, and we have the ability to make choices based on that character. Calvinists, who believe in this idea of a sinful nature, argue that God is in control of everything, even the fall of humanity. Some people find this hard to accept because it seems to suggest that God caused the fall. However, Calvinists would say that God didn't cause the fall in the way that a person causes something by directly making it happen. Instead, they believe that God allowed the fall to happen as part of His larger plan. Just like the geologic forces that produced the marble for a statue don't authorize the creation of the statue, God didn't authorize the fall, but He allowed it to happen. This brings us to another question. If God can make a world where everyone chooses to be good, why didn't He do that? The Bible promises that in heaven there will be no sin. This means that God is capable of creating a world where free-willed beings never choose to sin. But He chose to create a world where sin is possible. Why? The answer is that God's plan involves a greater good that comes from the existence of sin and the need for redemption. This is a mystery that we can't fully understand, but it's a central part of Christian faith. Finally, the Bible sometimes says that God wants everyone to be saved. For example, in Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, God says, "I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live." This can be confusing for Calvinists, who believe that God chooses to save only some people. However, Calvinists explain this by saying that God has two wills, a moral will and a providential will. God's moral will is His desire for all people to turn from their sin and be saved. His providential will is His plan for what actually happens. God's moral will is open to all, but His providential will means that not everyone will be saved. When the Bible says that God is impartial, it doesn't mean that He treats everyone the same. Instead, it means that God's choices are based on His perfect judgment, not on favoritism. In the New Testament, Paul writes that God chose people, "Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth." 1 Corinthians 1, 26-29. God's choices are based on His wisdom and love, not on human standards. In all of these discussions, the key is to understand that God's character is good, and His plan is perfect, even if we can't fully comprehend it. The mystery of God's sovereignty and human responsibility is a deep and complex topic, but it's one that invites us to trust in God's wisdom and love, even when we don't understand everything. In the Bible, especially in Acts 10 and Romans 2, we see that God doesn't show favoritism. Peter learns this lesson when he realizes that God's salvation is for everyone, not just the Jews. He says, "Truly, I understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation anyone who fears Him and does what is right is acceptable to Him." Acts chapter 10, verse 34-35. Similarly, Paul tells the Roman believers that God treats Jews and Gentiles equally, saying, "For God shows no partiality." Romans chapter 2, verse 11. But what does it mean for God to be impartial? It doesn't mean that God doesn't have favorites. Different Christian traditions have different ideas about why God favors some people over others. The Catholic Church says God favors those who use the sacraments. Arminians believe God favors those who choose to believe the gospel. Calvinists, on the other hand, say that God's reasons for favoring some people are mysterious and beyond our understanding. They believe God has a good reason, but it's not because of anything the person does or is. All these views agree that God doesn't favor people based on things like their social status or intelligence. However, non-Calvinist traditions still think God favors people based on something they do or are. For example, they might think someone is good enough or smart enough to be saved. Calvinism, though, says God's choice is completely impartial. He doesn't choose people because of anything they bring to the table. This makes God's impartiality as strong as it can be. Some people think that if God controls everything and has already chosen who will be saved, there's no point in trying to share the gospel, but this isn't true. God's plan includes our decisions. If God wants someone to be saved, He might use our efforts to evangelize as part of His plan. So, even though God is in control, our actions still matter. D. James Kennedy, a famous Calvinist pastor, used to say, "There are people out there who will go to hell unless you share the gospel with them." This shows that Calvinism actually encourages evangelism because it emphasizes that God uses our actions in His plan. Historically, Calvinist churches were often the leaders in evangelism. However, in recent times, some Calvinist churches have become less active in this area. This isn't because of their theology, but because they've lost the deep culture of Calvinism. When a church truly understands and lives out Calvinism, it sees evangelism as a vital part of its mission. One of the key teachings of Calvinism is that believers can be sure they are saved and will stay saved. This is different from other views. For example, Arminians believe you can lose your salvation if you turn away from God, so you can't be certain you'll be saved in the future. The Catholic Church says no one can be sure of their salvation at any point. Some people think that being certain of your salvation is arrogant. The Bible warns us about self-deception, and it can be hard to know if our faith is genuine. However, the Bible also tells us that we should be sure of our salvation. It's not about being arrogant. It's about having confidence in God's promises. Calvinists believe that if you have true faith, you will show it through your actions. John writes, "By this we know that we have come to know Him, if we keep His commandments." 1 John chapter 2, verse 3. This means that if you are truly saved, you will live a life that reflects your faith. You can examine your life to see if you are living in a way that shows you truly believe in God. True assurance doesn't make you arrogant. It makes you humble. When you are sure of God's love and salvation, you recognize that it's all because of God's grace, not because of anything you did. This understanding brings humility and gratitude, not pride. Sometimes people point to specific Bible passages to challenge Calvinist teachings. For example, they might say, "What about the passage where it says?" It's important to look at the whole Bible and understand the context of these passages. Calvinists believe that the Bible is consistent and that all its teachings fit together. When you read the Bible with this in mind, you can see how it supports the idea that God's people can be sure of their salvation. In the end, Calvinism offers a strong foundation for both evangelism and assurance. It encourages us to share the gospel because our actions matter in God's plan. And it gives us confidence that our salvation is secure because it's based on God's grace, not our own efforts. When we talk about Calvinism, we often dive right into the big, complicated questions. But before we can tackle those, it's important to understand why some people find Calvinism so compelling in the first place. This chapter is about that, helping you see why many believe Calvinism makes sense of the Bible and our world. Imagine you're trying to put together a massive puzzle. Each piece of the puzzle is a Bible verse. Some pieces fit together easily, while others seem to clash. Calvinism is like a framework that helps you see how all the pieces might fit together to form a coherent picture. It's not about ignoring the difficult pieces, it's about finding a way to understand them in the context of the whole puzzle. Now you might be thinking, but what about the Bible verses that seem to contradict Calvinism? That's a fair question. Calvinist writers have spent a lot of time addressing these passages. They've written books, articles, and even whole commentaries on them. If you're curious, I encourage you to read those resources. But for now, let's focus on the big picture. One of the core ideas in Calvinism is that God is sovereign. He's in control of everything. This can be a bit hard to grasp because it seems to conflict with the idea of human free will. If God is in control of everything, how can we make choices? Calvinists argue that God's sovereignty and human free will are both true, even if we can't fully understand how they work together. Think of it like this. Imagine you're playing a game where you have to guess what number I'm thinking of. You have free will to make your guess, but I, as the person running the game, already know what the number is. In a sense, I'm in control, but you still have the freedom to choose. Calvinists believe that God's sovereignty and human free will work in a similar way. Another key idea in Calvinism is that God's love is unconditional. This means that God loves us not because of anything we've done, but simply because He chooses to. This can be a comforting thought, especially if you've ever felt unworthy of God's love. Calvinists believe that God's love is so powerful that it can overcome even our deepest flaws and sins. There's also the idea of God's love being irresistible. Once God chooses to save someone, that person will be saved. This might sound unfair at first, but Calvinists argue that it's actually a sign of God's incredible grace. If we could choose to be saved on our own, it would be something we could take credit for. But Calvinists believe that salvation is entirely God's work, and that makes it a true act of grace. Finally, Calvinists believe that God's love is unbreakable. Once you're saved, you can't lose your salvation. This can be a source of great comfort and assurance. It means that no matter what happens in your life, you can trust that God will see you through. These ideas, sovereignty, unconditional love, irresistible grace, and unbreakable salvation, form the foundation of Calvinism. They help make sense of many of the Bible's teachings and provide a framework for understanding God's plan for humanity. But remember, this is just the beginning. If you're interested in diving deeper, there are plenty of resources out there. The important thing is to keep an open mind and a heart willing to learn. The journey of understanding Calvinism can be a rewarding one, and it might just change the way you see the world and your place in it. As we wrap up our journey through the heart of Reformed theology, it's important to reflect on the core message that has guided so many Christians for centuries. John Calvin, a key figure in the Reformation, taught that God's grace is the foundation of our salvation. J.I. Packer puts it simply, God saves sinners. This is the heart of Calvinism, and it's a message that has resonated with countless believers. Calvin's teachings weren't just about abstract ideas. They were about living a life that honors God. In Switzerland, where the Reformation took root, pastors were expected to lead by example, maintaining a high standard of moral integrity. This wasn't always easy, and in some parts of Europe, the message of the Reformation was compromised. But in places like Zurich, where the Reformation didn't have to make deals with immoral leaders, the standard remained high. This integrity helped shape the deep, rich culture of Reformed Christianity. One of the most common ways people understand Reformed theology is through the acronym TULIP, which stands for total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. However, it's important to know that TULIP wasn't actually part of the original Reformation. It was a later development, and while it can be a helpful summary, it's not the whole story. The Canons of Dort, which were the actual documents from the Reformed Church's council, didn't use TULIP. This is a reminder that the Reformed faith is much broader and deeper than any simple acronym. The Westminster Confession of Faith, a key document in Reformed theology, emphasizes that God's providence is at work in all things. This means that God's care and purpose extend beyond the church walls into every aspect of life. When we lose sight of this, our faith can become narrow and disconnected from the world around us. Instead, Reformed theology calls us to engage with the world, seeing God's hand in all things and living out our faith in every part of our lives. John Calvin himself wrote that true faith is more than just believing certain things. It's about living a life that shows our love for God, he said. We cannot possibly apprehend God as our Father unless at the same time, by living a holy life, we study to obey Him as our Father. This means that our faith should be visible in how we treat others, how we work, and how we approach the challenges of daily life. Another important aspect of Reformed theology is the assurance of salvation. Arthur Pink, a well-known Reformed theologian, emphasized that true faith brings a deep sense of assurance. This doesn't mean we become complacent. It means we can rest in the knowledge that God's grace is sufficient for us. Hodge, a respected pastor, taught that true assurance is balanced with humility. We can be confident in God's promises while recognizing our own weaknesses and need for grace. In the end, Reformed theology is about more than just beliefs. It's about a way of life. It's about trusting in God's grace, living with integrity, and seeing God's purpose in everything we do. As we continue our journey of faith, let's remember these core teachings and strive to live them out in our daily lives.